Then after 6 years of struggling, he decided that was enough. He's going to end it, either be enlightened or die trying. So he decided to sit under this tree and not get up until he attains enlightenment or he dies. So he sat under the Bodhi tree and he struggled, and he attained the first jhana, then the second, then the third, then the fourth jhana. The fourth jhana is a state very difficult to attain. The first 3 jhanas the Buddha calls perturbable, still shakeable. But the fourth jhana the Buddha calls unperturbable. Cannot shake, cannot goyang. So, because this fourth jhana is such a high state that the breathing stops. When the breathing stops, probably the heartbeat also is not detectable probably. So, in that deep state, then he used it to look into his past life. Because that state is so high, psychic power can come. So he used his psychic power to look into his past life. He looked at the past lives, many lifetimes. He looked into very many lifetimes, and then he realized who he was in the past, all the details. Then he realized that he was a monk before under Buddha Kassapa. So all the Dhamma that he had learned from Buddha Kassapa all came back to his mind. Then after that was the first watch of the night, from about 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. Then from 10 to 2 a.m., 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., which is called the middle watch of the night, he contemplated beings who died and passed on, because he had this heavenly psychic power, heavenly eye, to look at beings dying and passing away, dying and passing away. Then he understood the working of karma, how beings, because of the actions they do, they are reborn in whatever plane according to their karma. And then the last watch of the night, from 2 to 6 a.m., he contemplated on the Four Noble Truths and attained enlightenment. And this enlightenment of a Buddha is the same as the enlightenment of an Arahant. Now what is enlightenment? Can any of you tell me what is enlightenment? What defines enlightenment? How is a person enlightened? Is it because he has great wisdom? This is what nowadays people practicing Vipassana like to say. But it's not. In the suttas, enlightenment is defined as the destruction of the asavas. In the 6 higher knowledges, abhinyas, 5 are psychic powers. The last one, the most supreme, is called the destruction of the asavas. What are asavas? Asavas can be defined as uncontrolled mental outflows. That means the tendency of the mind to flow, to flow. And this tendency of the mind to flow is basically the flowing of consciousness. And when consciousness flows, you have the 6 types of consciousness: seeing consciousness, hearing, smelling, taste, touch, and thinking. The first 5, seeing, hearing, smelling, taste, and touch, when these 5 consciousness works, then you see the world, you hear the world, you smell, you taste, and you touch things in the world, right? So there is an external world because the 5 consciousness are working. The 6th consciousness is the mind, and this is our inner world, So the 6th consciousness gives you the outer and the inner world. So it is because of the flow of consciousness that this world is created. But when a person destroys the tendency of the mind to flow, then when he dies, when he passes away, the consciousness stops flowing, because he is already, as an Arahant, he is already able to stop it. So that is enlightenment, and enlightenment of Arahant and Buddha is the same. After enlightenment, our Buddha, he was enlightened under the Bodhi tree. So he sat under the Bodhi tree, feeling the happiness of enlightenment in the Vinaya book is called Vimutti Sukha. Sukha is happiness. Vimutti is liberation or freedom. So he said 7 days. That means he must have been experiencing that state of cessation of consciousness, which is called Nirodha Samapatti, or cessation of perception and feeling. Because when perception and feeling stops, then consciousness also stops, the normal six consciousness. So for 7 days you are sitting under there experiencing this bliss. Then after that he got up, and then out of gratitude to that Bodhi tree, he walked away from the Bodhi tree and looked at the Bodhi tree with gratitude, looking at this Bodhi tree which had been shading him for 7 days and 7 nights and helped him to become enlightened. Then after that he contemplated dependent origination. He spent the whole night contemplating dependent origination until he understood. The Buddha did not say that he knows everything, but the Buddha says that when he wants to know something, he has to contemplate, then he will know. That's why he had to spend the whole night contemplating dependent origination until he understood. Then after that, he moved to another tree, a banyan tree, and he sat under the banyan tree, also experiencing this bliss for 7 days. Then after that, he moved to a Muchalinda tree and stayed under the Muchalinda tree for 7 days or so, experiencing this bliss of enlightenment. And during these 7 days under the Muchalinda tree, a great storm arose. Rain came and a storm came. And this Naga, or this snake spirit, he realized that this was a holy man. So with this rain coming up, he wanted to protect the Buddha from the rain. So he used his big serpent body, the snake body, coil around the Buddha, and put his hood on top to shade the Buddha from the storm and the rain. Then when the rain stopped, he went away. Then the Buddha woke up, and then from his this cessation, then he went to the Raja Yatana tree and stayed under the tree, experiencing this bliss again for 7 days. Then after that, it means you calculate 7, 7, 7, 7, 28 days. He did not eat anything. Because a person like the Buddha, when he does not eat anything, he says that he feeds on happiness. The joy of meditation is enough to sort of energize his whole body. So he did not need to eat. Then after that, he contemplated whether he should teach what he had learned to human beings. And then he realized that most human beings are not interested in the Dhamma. So he thought it's a waste of time to try to teach human beings. Most of them are not inclined to struggle for enlightenment. We all tend to follow our tendencies, our natural tendencies. So he decided not to teach. But this Brahma Sahampati, this Deva in the Brahma realm, he realized that here was a Buddha, and it's very rare to meet a Buddha. So he came down and appealed to the Buddha to teach. And he appealed to the Buddha 3 times. And after appealing to the Buddha 3 times, the Buddha, he told the Buddha, he said, it is true, most beings in the world are not interested to practice the Dhamma. But there are some beings in this world with little dust in their eyes. And if you don't teach them, they will instead of progressing, they will regress. And then the Buddha contemplated, then he realized that there are some beings who had already practiced the spiritual path in the past life, and those who had attained jhana and all that, and it would be a waste if they don't hear the Dhamma. So the Buddha then decided to teach the Dhamma. Then he asked himself, who should he teach first? Then he thought about his earlier two teachers, Uddaka Ramaputta and Alara Kalama. Okay, so our Buddha wanted to teach his two previous teachers. And then the Devas came to tell him that his teachers had passed away. One of them had died 7 days ago, and the other one had died just one night, the previous night. And he thought it was such a waste. If he had taught them, they would have understood his Dhamma immediately, because they had attained jhana. Then he contemplated who he should teach next. Then he thought about his 5 disciples, the 5 bhikkhus under him. So he decided to go and teach them. So he had to walk a certain distance to teach them. And on the way, he met an external ascetic by the name of Upaka. And this Upaka, when he saw the Buddha, he was struck by the serenity and by the glowing face of the Buddha. And the Buddha's faculties were so clear. And he was very impressed. So he asked the Buddha, who is your teacher? Then the Buddha said, how can someone like me have a teacher? The Buddha said he's basically saying that he was enlightened, that there's nobody superior to him. And then this guy, this Upaka, he shook his head. You know, Indians like to shake their head. So he shook his head and he thought maybe. Then he walked away. So you see, it's so difficult to teach people. This guy had the great fortune to meet the Buddha, and the Buddha was sort of all eager to teach somebody. And this guy met the Buddha, was not fully convinced, just shook his head and walked away. Then the Buddha went to his 5 disciples. At first they were they agreed not to welcome him, but when he came nearer, they saw he looked so radiant and so serene that they were immediately struck by it. So even though they made a pact not to welcome him, but they automatically, one went to get a seat for him, one went to get water for washing his feet, etc. So he sat down on the seat, washed his feet. Then they called him friend. Probably previously also they called him friend or something. And he told them not to address him as friend. He said he was enlightened. But they were not convinced. They still called him friend. And even though he told them 3 times not to call him friend, they still called him friend. Then he asked them. They said, previously when you were doing all the austerities, all the ascetic practices, you were not enlightened. Now that you have reverted to luxury, eating 1 good meal a day, every day, how can you become enlightened? Then he tried to convince them. They were not convinced. Eventually, he asked them, I said, have I ever spoken to you like this before? Then they said, no, you have never spoken to us like this before. Then he said, listen to him. He said he's enlightened and all that. Then they decided to listen to him. Then he taught them the Dhamma. The first teaching he gave them was called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. And upon hearing this sutta, one of the 5 attained the first path. And then over a number of days, he just asked them to sit down, and he continued to preach to them the Dhamma. And then when it came to meal time, he said sometimes 2 of them will go pindabat on alms round and come back with enough food to feed all the 6 of them. Sometimes 3 of them will go alms round, bring back enough food to feed all of them. So for several days, he taught them the Dhamma. until all 5 of them became arahants. So you see from here, even attaining the first path is just by listening to the Dhamma. Attaining arahanthood, also listening to the Dhamma. He never asked them to sit in meditation, no? Just asked them to listen to the Dhamma. It shows how important listening to the Dhamma is. Then after that, the Buddha, with his psychic power, he looked for particular persons to teach. Then he looked for the next person was Yasa, a very rich man's son, also like the Buddha as a layman. But this man had a few wives, not like the Buddha had only one wife. This man, I think, had 4 wives. And yet the Buddha made him come to the forest to see the Buddha in the middle of the night. Then the Buddha taught him the Dhamma, and then he attained the first path. Then after that, he didn't want to go home. He stayed with the Buddha. The next morning, his father was worried, sick, because his son was missing. So his father was a very rich man, probably the richest man in that town. So his father went looking for him all over the place until the father came to the forest, and then came to see the Buddha and asked the Buddha whether he had seen the son. So the Buddha asked him to sit down and said, maybe in a while you will see Yasa. Actually, Yasa was sitting next to the Buddha, but the Buddha used his psychic power to shield Yasa from the father so that the father could not see. So then the Buddha preached to the father the same Dhamma that he had spoken to Yasa. And this Dhamma that the Buddha preaches to a new person normally consists of 9 things. The first one is dana, charity. The second one is sila, keeping the precepts. Then the third one is going to heaven. As a result of these 2 things you do, you go to heaven. Then the fourth one is the folly, the vanity, the depravity of sensual pleasures. All the sensual pleasures that we enjoy is actually all sort of never satisfying. So, and then it makes you more greedy for sensual pleasures. So after that, if a person realizes this, then he renounces. So that's 5 things already. Then after that, the Buddha will explain the 4 noble truths. So altogether 9 things. So after hearing the 4 noble truths, a person would attain Dhamma vision. That means the first path, Arya. So the Buddha spoke this to the father, and the father became a first path attainer. And Yasa, hearing this a second time, became an Arahant. The Buddha said that if a person has attained jhana, either in this life or the previous life, then upon hearing the Dhamma, you can attain anagami, third fruition, or arahanthood, 4th fruition, or the path first. So Yasa became an arahant. That was the 6th arahant. Then 54 of Yasa's good friends, they must have been his renunciant friends in the previous life. They were surprised that he had renounced. So one by one they came to see him. And when they came to see him, he brought them to see the Buddha. And Buddha taught them the Dhamma. And all 54 of them became arahants. One by one they became arahants. So Yasa and his friends, 55 of them, plus the earlier 5 bhikkhus, that means there were 60 arahants at that time. And when there were 60 arahants, the Buddha asked them to walk and preach the Dhamma for the good of the many folk. And the Buddha asked them not to go by the same road. He said, don't 2 of you go by the same road. Go by different roads and preach the Dhamma. So when they went around preaching the Dhamma, and people who understood the Dhamma wanted to renounce, and these 60 arahants would send them to the Buddha to get ordination. And slowly more and more people came for ordination. And the Buddha find that it was very troublesome to look for him to ordain. Then he gave his monk disciples the permission to ordain other monks. And the first time that this was allowed, they ordain somebody just by giving them the 3 refuges like Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, Dhammang Saranang Gacchami, etc. Repeating that 3 times, and they will be considered as ordained. The Buddha wanted to go and teach these Jatilas, matted hair ascetics, who lived in Uruvela by the banks of the Naranjara river, I think. They were matted hair ascetics because they kept long hair and tied them around the head. And they were fire worshippers. They prayed to fire. And they also had the practice of submerging themselves in the river 3 times in the morning before the sun rose, and 3 times at night after the sun had set. They would submerge themselves fully in the river to cleanse away their sins, just like a Brahmin practice. But I suppose the reason why the Buddha wanted to go and teach them was because they practiced samatha meditation. That means they had attained the jhanas. The Buddha, when he wants to teach somebody, this is the best type of person to teach them, because when he teaches them the Dhamma, they will become Arahant. So actually they were already quite famous because these monks had attained jhana, and people thought that they were Arahants. In fact, the leader himself thought that he was an Arahant. So when the Buddha came, the Buddha had to show a lot of psychic power to convince them that the Buddha was on a higher spiritual level. And after showing them a lot of psychic power, then they were convinced, One of the incidents was because they were staying beside the river bank. One day the river overflowed. There was a big flood, and the water level went up very high, maybe say, for example, 10 feet. So then they all sort of went to higher ground. Then they realized that they had forgotten about this Samana Gotama, because he was known as Samana Gotama. Then they thought he might have drowned. So they decided to take a boat and look for him. So when they rowed the boat to where he was staying, they found that the water was all around him, but where the Buddha was standing, there was no water. In other words, the wall of water was all around the Buddha. So they were surprised. They took their boat up there and they asked him to come up. So he just went up and the water closed again. So after convincing them by much display of psychic power, another one was, for example, this Brahma came to visit the Buddha in the middle of the night. When this Deva comes to visit the Buddha, they will emit a lot of light, So they saw, but they didn't know who it was. Possibly, an ordinary person would not be able to see that light, but because they had cultivated jhana, they could see the light. So the next morning they asked the Buddha, who came to visit you at night? And then the Buddha said, Brahma. And they were shocked. They had to pray to Brahma, but Brahma comes to pay respect to the Buddha. So in that way, eventually they were convinced that the Buddha was very much superior to them. Then all of 1,000 of them shaved their hair and became disciples of the Buddha. And then after they became these disciples of the Buddha taught them the Dhamma. And the Buddha gave them a discourse called the Adita Pariyaya Sutta, or the fire discourse. Used fire to teach them because they worship the fire. See? The Buddha said the whole world is on fire. Why? Because the eye is on fire, the ear is on fire, the nose, the tongue, the body, the mind is on fire. What fire? The fire of greed, hatred and delusion going through the 6 sense doors. So at the conclusion of this discourse, all 1,000 of them became Arahants. Then after that, the Buddha brought them 1,000 of these Arahants to Rajagaha. Because before the Buddha was enlightened, the Buddha had passed through Rajagaha and had met this King Bimbisara. And King Bimbisara was so impressed by the Buddha's looks that he tried to persuade the Buddha to stay in Rajagaha, to practice, cultivate in Rajagaha. And the king said the king would support him. But because the Buddha was the great yearning for enlightenment, he did not want to be tied down in a place. He thought he could not practice well being tied down in a place, so he left. But the king made him promise that if he was enlightened, he would come back and teach them the Dhamma. So after the Buddha was enlightened, he decided to keep his promise. So he brought these 1,000 arahants to Rajagaha. And then the king made a great dana, a great feast for the Buddha and his these 1,000 former jatilas, and called all his people of the city of Rajagaha to come. So according to the Vinaya books, 12 nahutas of people came, and one nahuta is a huge number according to the Pali dictionary. According to the commentaries, one nahuta can be said to be 10,000. So 120,000 people came, to see the Buddha and his 1,000 arahants. So when they saw the Buddha and his these jatilas, former jatilas, they were not sure who's the teacher, whether Samana Gautama is the teacher or the jatila's head is the teacher. So the Buddha knew what they were thinking. So the Buddha purposely asked the former leader of the jatila, said, "What did you see that made you shave off your hair and renounce?" And then he understood what the Buddha wanted him to say. Then he explained that he saw the Dhamma. And then after that he said, "The Buddha is my teacher, I am his disciple." After he said that, he bowed to the Buddha. So he said that 3 times and bowed to the Buddha 3 times. So everybody knew that the Buddha was the leader of this group of ascetics. So after that, the Buddha preached the Dhamma, just now the 9-point Dhamma I told you, to the people of Rajagaha. And all 120,000 of them attained the Dhamma vision. All became first path Arya. So you see, not so difficult to become an Arya. All listened to the 4 noble truths and became an Arya. The Buddha never asked them to sit down and practice meditation, just asked them to listen to the Dhamma. Then the king Bimbisara offered the bamboo grove to the Buddha and the Sangha as a monastery. It was just a bamboo grove. You find that this King Bimbisara, he became a disciple of the Buddha. So he offered this bamboo grove. According to the Vinaya book, how he offered this grove to the Buddha was, he brought the Buddha to this bamboo grove and told him that he was offering this whole bamboo grove, don't know how many acres. And then the Buddha accepted in the Indian tradition by cupping his hands, and King Bimbisara poured water into his hands. It's just like our Malay Basanding ceremony, isn't it? They pour water. This is an old Indian custom. So you can see that a monk actually can accept a land for a monastery, but not for himself, for the Sangha. So that's now this bamboo grove. At that time, there was no buildings. It was just a grove of bamboo trees. No buildings whatsoever. And initially, the Buddha and his disciples, they just stayed under the trees. They did not have kutis or huts to stay in.